We were having dinner at her parents' house, a monthly tradition that I usually dreaded but tolerated for her sake. The food was good as always, but the conversation had shifted to home repairs, with her father boasting about fixing their bathroom sink. Speaking of which, my wife suddenly interjected with a laugh that made my stomach tighten. "You should have seen the disaster when our kitchen sink was leaking last week." All eyes turned to me as she continued. "He spent 3 hours trying to fix it, got completely soaked, and ended up making it worse." Her family erupted in laughter as she delivered the punchline. "He can't even fix a sink. We had to call a plumber who fixed it in 15 minutes. The laughter felt deafening. Her father shook his head with that look of disappointment he perfected over the years. Her mother tried to soften the blow with a weak, "Well, not everyone is handy around the house," which somehow made it worse. Even her teenage brother smirked at me from across the table. I forced a smile and tried to laugh it off, but inside something broke. It wasn't just about the sink. For months, I'd noticed how she would roll her eyes when I spoke, how she'd interrupt me mid-sentence, how she'd make these harmless jokes at my expense in front of friends and family. Each incident on its own seemed minor, but that night, it all crystallized into a painful realization. She didn't respect me anymore. The drive home was silent. She was still in good spirits, chatting about her family's news, completely oblivious to how deeply her words had cut. Or perhaps she knew and didn't care. That thought was even worse. "You're awfully quiet," she finally said as we pulled into our driveway. "Just tired," I replied, not ready to confront what had happened. Not yet. That night, lying awake while she slept soundly beside me, I replayed every moment of our relationship in my mind. We'd been married for 6 years. The first few were amazing. We were partners, equals, best friends. But somewhere along the way, that balance had shifted. I'd become the butt of her jokes, the incompetent husband who couldn't do anything right. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. I had let myself go a bit, sure. Work stress had taken its toll, but the man staring back at me wasn't just physically tired. His eyes showed defeat. "This ends now," I whispered to my reflection. The humiliation at dinner wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a wake-up call. Our marriage was broken, and ironically, it was now up to me to fix it, something far more complex than a leaky sink. I didn't want a divorce. Despite everything, I still loved her. But I couldn't continue like this. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. As I showered and got ready for work, a plan began forming in my mind. I wouldn't confront her directly. That would only lead to defensive arguments and temporary changes. No, this required strategy and patience. I needed to rebuild myself first, then our relationship. I needed to fix our marriage in a way that would last, addressing the root cause rather than just the symptoms. That morning, I left for work with a newfound determination. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. The sink incident may have been the lowest point of our marriage, but it would also be the turning point. Little did she know that her public humiliation had lit a fire within me, one that would ultimately transform not just me, but our entire relationship. The week after that dinner, I started observing our interactions with new awareness. What I saw disturbed me. The disrespect wasn't isolated to family gatherings. It had infiltrated every aspect of our relationship. When I spoke, she'd check her phone. When I suggested something, she'd dismiss it without consideration. The subtle eye rolls, the sighs, the dismissive tone, they were all symptoms of a deeper problem. I initially considered confronting her directly. "Do you realize how you speak to me?" I rehearsed these conversations in my head during my commute, but always reached the same conclusion. Direct confrontation would only lead to defensive arguments, temporary changes, and eventually a return to the same patterns. Instead, I made my first strategic decision. That weekend, I woke up early while she was still asleep and drove to the hardware store. The same elderly employee who had helped me during my failed sink repair attempt recognized me. "Back for round 2 with that sink?" he asked with a friendly smile. "Something like that," I replied. "But this time, I want to learn properly, not just a quick fix." For the next hour, he walked me through basic plumbing concepts, recommended several tutorial videos, and helped me select the right tools. I bought a basic plumbing toolkit and a couple of books on home repair. The total cost made me wince, but I considered it an investment, not just in practical skills, but in my self-respect. That afternoon, I claimed our guest bathroom as my workshop and spent hours watching tutorials. My wife peered in occasionally, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. She probably thought it was a passing phase, another failed attempt to prove something. I let her think that. "Don't flood the house." That was her only comment, followed by that laugh I'd grown to hate, the one that implied I was a joke. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on learning. By evening, I had disassembled and reassembled the guest bathroom sink twice. No leaks. Small victory, but it felt significant. Over the next 2 weeks, I expanded my learning beyond plumbing, electrical repairs, drywall patching, basic carpentry. I absorbed everything I could. I wasn't just developing practical skills, I was rebuilding my confidence piece by piece. I'd come home from work and spend an hour or two in my workshop before dinner. My wife's initial curiosity had faded into indifference, which suited me fine. But my plan wasn't limited to becoming handy around the house. The sink comment had been the breaking point, but the issue was more profound. She no longer saw me as capable or worthy of respect, so I expanded my self-improvement campaign. I started waking up an hour earlier to exercise before work. I updated my wardrobe, replacing the worn-out clothes I'd held onto for too long. I scheduled a dentist appointment I'd been postponing, and got a haircut at a proper barber shop instead of the discount chain I usually visited. These changes were subtle at first, a comment from a colleague about whether I'd lost weight, the barista at my regular coffee shop doing a double take when I walked in. Small affirmations that the changes were noticeable. At home, however, my wife seemed oblivious, or perhaps deliberately unimpressed. When I fixed the wobbly dining room chair that had been annoying her for months, her response was a flat finally. No acknowledgement that just weeks ago she wouldn't have trusted me with such a task. Her indifference stung, but also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about seeking her approval anymore. It was about reclaiming my own sense of competence and worth. For too long, I'd internalized her perception of me. Now I was breaking free from that destructive pattern. The real test came 3 weeks after the dinner incident. Our kitchen faucet, the very one that had humiliated me, started leaking again. This time, when she pointed it out with that familiar tone of resignation, I simply nodded. "I'll take care of it," I said casually, continuing to read my book. "Should I get the plumber's number?" she asked, the skepticism evident in her voice. I looked up at her calmly. "No need. I've got it." The surprise on her face was worth every hour I'd spent learning. The next morning, while she was at yoga, I fixed the leak in 20 minutes. No drama, no flooding, no cursing, just quiet competence. When she returned and used the sink, she paused, testing the faucet repeatedly. I pretended not to notice, continuing with my breakfast. "Did you fix this?" she finally asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Yes," I replied simply, not offering further explanation. Her expression, a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't quite identify, told me the first phase of my plan was working. The foundation was being laid. Now it was time to build upon it. The fixed kitchen faucet became a silent symbol between us, undeniable evidence that something had changed. While she never explicitly acknowledged my accomplishment, I noticed her watching me more carefully in the weeks that followed. The dismissive glances were replaced with curious ones, especially when I would disappear into my workshop after dinner. I expanded my self-improvement beyond household repairs. I'd always enjoyed cooking, but had settled into making the same 5 or 6 dishes on rotation. Now I started experimenting with more complex recipes on the weekends. The first few attempts were mediocre, but by the 3rd weekend, I'd mastered a perfectly seared steak with a wine reduction that even impressed me. "This is really good," she said that evening. Genuine surprise in her voice as she took another bite. "Thanks," I replied simply, not showing how much her comment meant to me. "Just tried something new." At work, I applied the same methodical approach to my professional development. I volunteered for a project most colleagues avoided because of its complexity. The long hours were exhausting, but they gave me a convenient excuse to maintain emotional distance at home. When my boss publicly acknowledged my contributions during a staff meeting, something shifted in my professional self-image. 1 month into my transformation plan, I received an unexpected text from her sister. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep it up. She's noticed." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Her sister had always been friendly toward me, sometimes acting as a buffer during family gatherings. The fact that she was reaching out suggested my wife had been talking about me, which meant the changes were affecting her more than she let on. 2 days later, we were invited to dinner at her friend's house. The same friend who had witnessed several of my wife's harmless jokes at my expense in the past. As we drove there, I could sense her nervousness, the way she kept glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking. "You seem different lately," she finally said, breaking the silence. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "I don't know, just different." "Are you upset about something?" I considered my response carefully. "Not upset, just focused on myself," I replied honestly. "Things I've been neglecting." She fell silent after that, clearly unsatisfied with my answer, but unable to argue with it. The dinner itself was a turning point. When her friend's husband mentioned problems with their backyard deck, I offered some suggestions based on my recent woodworking research. The conversation naturally shifted, with me participating more than I had in years at these gatherings. I caught my wife watching me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time, something between curiosity and attraction. When her friend made a joke about hopeless husbands, there was an awkward pause as everyone glanced at my wife, waiting for her to chime in with her usual story about my incompetence. Instead, she changed the subject. On the drive home, the car was filled with a different kind of tension, no longer the cold distance of recent weeks, but something charged and uncertain. "You've lost weight," she said suddenly. "A little," I acknowledged. "And the thing you said about deck support beams, where did you learn that?" "I've been reading, learning things." She nodded slowly. Are you seeing someone else?" The question caught me off guard. I actually laughed. A genuine laugh, the first one between us in months. "No," I said honestly, "this isn't about anyone else." When we arrived home, she reached for my hand as we walked to the front door, a small gesture that would have been unremarkable a year ago, but now felt significant. I let her take it, but didn't squeeze back with the eagerness I once would have. The power dynamic between us was shifting, and we both felt it. That night, as she slept beside me, I reflected on my progress. The physical changes were obvious. I lost 15 pounds, my posture had improved, and I dressed better. But the internal transformation was more profound. I no longer flinched when she used that dismissive tone. I no longer sought her approval for every decision. I had reclaimed parts of myself that I had surrendered over the years. Yet, despite this progress, I recognized that fixing myself was only half the solution. Our marriage remained in a precarious state, different than before, but not yet healed. The respect I'd lost was slowly returning, but trust and intimacy lagged behind. The coming weeks would determine whether we could build something new from the ruins of what we had, or whether my transformation would ultimately lead us in separate directions. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to acknowledge a difficult truth. I wasn't sure which outcome I wanted anymore. What I did know was that I wouldn't return to being the punchline of her jokes. That version of me was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood his worth with or without her approval. The real test came when we received an invitation to her parents' house for dinner, the same setting where she had humiliated me 2 months earlier. When the invitation arrived via text, I watched her face as she read it, noticing how she glanced up at me with uncertainty before responding. "My parents want us over for dinner this Saturday," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I can make an excuse if you'd rather not go." This consideration was new, a small acknowledgement that the previous dinner had been problematic. I considered declining, but realized this was an opportunity to measure how far we'd come. "No need. Let's go," I replied calmly. Her surprise was evident, but she didn't press further. The days leading up to the dinner were filled with attention that hadn't been there before. I caught her watching me several times, as if trying to predict how I would behave. When Saturday arrived, I dressed with deliberate care, not formally, but in the new clothes that fit my trimmer frame well. As we drove to her parents' house, she seemed increasingly nervous. "You know," she began hesitantly, "my dad might bring up the sink thing again. He thinks it's funny." I nodded. "He's welcome to his opinions. You've been so different lately," she said, her voice dropping. "Sometimes I feel like I don't know what you're thinking anymore." For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for the emotional distance I'd maintained. But I reminded myself that this distance had been necessary, not as punishment, but as protection while I rebuilt myself. "I'm thinking that we need to start being honest with each other," I finally said as we pulled into her parents' driveway. Really honest about everything. The look she gave me was filled with both fear and hope, an expression that suggested she understood exactly what I meant. Dinner began much as it always did. Her mother asked about work. Her father dominated the conversation with stories about his latest projects. But there was a subtle difference in how they interacted with me, an attentiveness that hadn't been there before. Word had clearly gotten around about my changes, possibly through her sister. Inevitably, her father brought up home repairs. "So, fixed any sinks lately?" he asked with that same smirk from 2 months ago. Before I could respond, my wife spoke up. "Actually, he fixed our kitchen faucet last month. Did a better job than the plumber." The surprise around the table was palpable. Her father looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Is that right?" "Yes," I said simply. "It turned out I just needed to learn the right techniques." "Well, I've got a leaky shower head upstairs that's been driving me crazy," he said, his tone shifting from mockery to something approaching respect. "Mind taking a look after dinner?" 30 minutes later, I was fixing his shower while he handed me tools, a complete reversal of roles that wasn't lost on either of us. The repair was simple, something I could now do almost automatically after all my practice. "You've changed," he said bluntly as I tightened the final fitting. "Not just the handyman stuff. Something else." I met his gaze directly. "I needed to." He nodded slowly. "Good for you. She needs someone who can stand their ground." When we returned downstairs, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Throughout the rest of the evening, I participated in conversations on equal footing, disagreeing with her father on politics, sharing genuine opinions instead of just nodding along as I used to. The drive home was quiet, but charged with unspoken tension. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, she turned to me. "Why didn't you tell me you were fixing things for my dad?" "You didn't ask," I replied simply. "This whole transformation," she gestured vaguely at me. "It's because of what I said about the sink, isn't it?" That night, it was the first direct acknowledgement of the incident that had started everything. I turned off the engine and faced her. Not just that. It was a tipping point, but it had been building for a long time. Her eyes filled with tears, something I hadn't expected. "I know I've been awful to you. The jokes, the way I talk to you sometimes. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until you started changing, and I saw how everyone reacted to you differently." I had imagined this moment many times over the past weeks, rehearsing what I would say. But now, faced with her genuine remorse, the practice speeches felt wrong. "Why did it happen?" I asked instead. "When did I become someone you could mock publicly without a second thought?" She wiped her eyes, looking down at her hands. "I don't know. It started small. You'd laugh along, so I thought it was okay. Then it just escalated. And maybe I was trying to make myself feel better about my own insecurities by putting you down." Her honesty surprised me. I had expected defensiveness, not this raw vulnerability. "We can't go back to how things were," I said firmly. "I won't go back to that." "I know," she whispered. "I don't want that either. I want to try again, differently." As we sat in the darkened car, I realized we had reached the critical juncture. The work I'd done on myself had created this opportunity, but what came next would determine whether our marriage could be salvaged or whether my transformation would ultimately lead me away from her. For the first time in months, I reached for her hand intentionally, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We have a lot to talk about," I said quietly, "and a lot to rebuild." She nodded, squeezing back. "I'm ready if you are." That night marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, one that would require both of us to change, not just me. The conversation in the car that night opened a floodgate. We talked until dawn, really talked, about patterns we'd fallen into, expectations we'd never voiced, resentments we'd harbored. It was exhausting and painful, but also cleansing. By morning, we were emotionally drained but had established a fragile foundation to build upon. "We need rules," I said, as we sat at the kitchen table, cups of coffee growing cold between us. "Boundaries that neither of us can cross again." She nodded, eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "Like what?" "No more public humiliation. Not even as a joke. If you have an issue with something I do or don't do, we discuss it privately." "Agreed," she said immediately. "And I need you to tell me when something hurts you. Don't bottle it up for months until you reach a breaking point." She was right. My silence had enabled the pattern as much as her behavior had created it. I had retreated rather than confronted, allowing the disrespect to grow unchecked. "I'll do that," I promised. "But you need to listen when I do speak up. Really listen, not dismiss it as me being too sensitive." The following weeks were awkward but hopeful. We were hyper-aware of our interactions, sometimes overcorrecting to the point of excessive politeness. There were setbacks, moments when she would slip into old habits, starting a sentence with that familiar mocking tone before catching herself. I had my stumbles too, retreating into defensive silence when we disagreed instead of engaging directly. But there was progress. We instituted weekly check-ins, designated times to discuss concerns before they festered. We started doing things together again, cooking classes, weekend hikes, activities that gave us new shared experiences outside our established patterns. One night, about a month after our breakthrough, she joined me in the workshop as I was building a small bookshelf for our living room. Instead of hovering skeptically, she asked if I could teach her some basics. We spent the evening working side by side, her learning to sand wood properly while I assembled the frame. "I used to be intimidated by your father," I admitted as we worked. "His constant projects, the way he could fix anything. I felt like I was being measured against him and failing." She paused, sandpaper in hand. "He intimidated my ex before you too. I never realized I was comparing you to him. That wasn't fair. These small moments of honesty continued to accumulate, each one helping to rebuild trust between us. The physical changes I had made, the weight loss, the improved wardrobe, remained, but they were no longer the most significant aspects of my transformation. The internal shift in how I valued myself had become permanent. The true test came 3 months after that fateful dinner. We were hosting a small gathering at our home. Her family, a few close friends, the kind of audience before which she had often mocked me in the past. I felt her tension as we prepared, the way she kept glancing at me nervously. As everyone gathered in our living room, her father admired the new bookshelf. "Nice work," he said, inspecting the joints. "Professional quality." "Thanks," I replied easily. "Took some practice to get the miters right." Her mother joined the conversation. "You've become quite the handyman. Remember when you couldn't even fix a sink?" There was a sudden uncomfortable silence. All eyes shifted between me and my wife, everyone remembering the incident that had become something of a family joke. It was the perfect opening for another humiliating story. My wife took a deep breath. "Actually, Mom, I need to say something about that." She turned to face the room, but her eyes found mine. "I owe my husband an apology. I've made jokes at his expense for too long, about the sink and other things. The truth is, he's always been capable and supportive in ways that really matter. I just failed to appreciate them." The room remained silent, everyone slightly uncomfortable with this unexpected vulnerability. "Anyway," she continued with a small smile, "now he can fix sinks too. Better than any plumber we've hired. But even if he couldn't, I was wrong to make him feel less than for it." Later, after everyone had left and we were cleaning up, I pulled her into a hug. "Thank you for that," I said quietly. "I meant it," she replied, resting her head against my chest. "And I'm still sorry." "I know," I said. "I forgive you." And I realized, saying the words aloud, that I truly did. The anger that had fueled my initial transformation had evolved into something healthier, self-respect, that didn't depend on her validation, but also didn't require her diminishment. That night, lying in bed, she traced the outline of my face with her fingertip, a gesture of tenderness she hadn't shown in years. "I'm proud of who you've become," she whispered. "Not just the skills or the weight loss, who you are now. Stronger, more confident." "I needed to do it for myself," I replied, "not for your approval." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it real. That's why it worked." As I drifted toward sleep, I realized we had reached a new equilibrium, not the naive happiness of our early years, but something more durable. A relationship between two people who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to stay, to rebuild, to grow. The sink that had symbolized my inadequacy had become the catalyst for saving our marriage, not because I learned to fix it, but because it forced us both to confront the brokenness beneath the surface. 1 year after that humiliating dinner, we found ourselves preparing for the anniversary celebration my in-laws host annually. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, reflecting on the journey of the past 12 months. The man looking back at me was physically different, trimmer, better dressed, standing straighter. But the real transformation remained invisible to the casual observer, the inner confidence that no longer hinged on external validation, the self-respect that had become my foundation. My wife appeared behind me, placing her hands on my shoulders and meeting my eyes in the reflection. "Ready for this?" she asked. I nodded. "Different circumstances this time." She smiled, understanding my meaning. The last year had been challenging, requiring consistent effort from both of us. There were still moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, a dismissive tone here, a defensive withdrawal there. But now we recognized them immediately, addressing them before they could take root again. The dinner party was lively as always, her family gathering to celebrate another year together. When her father proposed a toast, raising his glass to the assembled family members, I felt my wife's hand tighten around mine under the table. "To another year of family," her father said, "and to growth and change. Some of us have learned new skills," he nodded toward me with genuine respect, "and some of us have learned new perspectives." His eyes moved to my wife, with an approving smile. After dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen with her mother, helping to load the dishwasher, a task I would have avoided a year ago, fearing I'd do it incorrectly and become the subject of another joke. "You know," her mother said quietly, "I've never seen my daughter so attentive to her relationship before. The way she looks at you now is different." I continued arranging plates, unsure how to respond. "She told me what happened," she continued, "about the sink comment, about how she used to treat you. I should have said something back then, called her out on it. I'm sorry I didn't." "It's in the past," I said simply. She shook her head. "Still, you fixed more than just your marriage. You showed her something important, about respect, about dignity. Later that evening, during the drive home, my wife was unusually quiet. When we pulled into our driveway, she didn't immediately move to get out of the car. "Remember last year?" she asked suddenly. "After the dinner where I said that awful thing about the sink?" "Hard to forget," I replied honestly. "You drove home in silence. I thought you were just tired." She turned to face me fully. "I had no idea I'd nearly destroyed us. I considered this. I don't think either of us knew how far we drifted, how unhealthy things had become." "When did you forgive me?" she asked, her voice smaller than usual. "Really forgive me, not just say the words." The question deserved careful consideration. I thought back over the landmarks of our reconstruction, the night-long conversation, her public apology, the countless small moments of renewed consideration and respect. It wasn't one moment, I finally said. It was watching you consistently choose to be different, even when it was difficult, even when old habits would have been easier. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I almost lost you without even realizing it was happening." "But you didn't," I reminded her gently. That night, lying in bed together, she traced the outline of my face, a gesture that had become a symbol of our reconnection, of seeing each other clearly again. "You know what I realized?" she said softly. "All those jokes I made about your supposed incompetence, they were never really about you. They were about me trying to feel superior to mask my own insecurities." "I know," I replied. "That's why they hurt so much. They weren't just jokes. They were a worldview. One where I was lesser." "Never again," she promised. "Not ever." As we drifted toward sleep, I reflected on the strange path that had brought us here. The humiliation that had nearly broken us had ultimately saved us, forcing a reckoning that might otherwise have never come. The sink that couldn't be fixed had revealed deeper leaks in our foundation, the kind that, left untreated, eventually collapsed the entire structure. 6 months later, we hosted our own dinner party. As our friends and family gathered around our table, I caught my wife watching me from across the room with a warmth that still surprised me sometimes. When her father mentioned his latest plumbing disaster, everyone tensed slightly, the memory of that fateful comment still lingering. But my wife just smiled and said, "Maybe my husband could take a look at it for you this weekend. He's pretty good with that stuff now." It wasn't the words themselves that mattered. It was the tone, pride instead of mockery, partnership instead of belittlement. The small nods of approval around the table told me everyone heard the difference. Later that night, after everyone had gone and we were cleaning up together, she bumped her hip against mine playfully. "So, handyman, what other skills are you hiding these days?" I laughed, pulling her close. "I'm still learning. We both are." And that was the truth of it. The journey that began with humiliation had led to mutual growth, to a marriage stronger than before, because it had been broken and deliberately rebuilt. We had fixed it together, addressing the root causes rather than just patching the symptoms. The sink comment that once cut so deeply had lost its power entirely. Now, it was just a marker of how far we'd come, a reference point for the before and after of our relationship. The husband who couldn't fix a sink had fixed something far more complex and valuable, a partnership worth saving, worth fighting for, worth transforming ourselves to preserve. That, I realized, was the most important repair of all,